8:15 in the morning, the Philippine Sea. The KC-135 Stratotanker, callsign Lancer 70, banked slowly over the empty blue water. It was carrying 42,000 kilograms of volatile jet fuel. Usually, a pair of F-35 fighters would be flying off its wings for protection. Today, a technical failure had forced the escorts to turn back to Guam. Lancer 70 was alone. What happens when a defenseless fuel truck meets a ghost on the radar? The crew did not have an answer yet. The morning sun was a bright coin against the deep indigo of the ocean. High above the clouds, the air was thin and perfectly still. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The Stratotanker moved, like a heavy bird through the upper atmosphere. Its 4 engines hummed a low and steady song. This sound was the heartbeat of the mission. It provided a false sense of security to the crew of 4. The aircraft commander was Major Thomas Reed. He adjusted the autopilot and stared into the horizon. The tanker was a flying gas station. It was the backbone of American power in the Pacific. Without it, the shorter-ranged fighters were tethered to their bases. Removing a tanker from the sky was more effective than shooting down a dozen jets. This made the KC-135 the most valuable target in the theater. 600 miles to the west, a J-16 strike fighter roared off a concrete runway. The Chinese pilot did not use his radio. His mission was clear. He was to find the intruder and remind them who owned this piece of the world. He was a predator in his element. His aircraft was fast and modern. It carried a lethal array of air-to-air missiles. He stayed low to avoid the long-range sensors of the American fleet. Back on the tanker, the radar warning receiver remained silent. The Stratotanker was a reliable workhorse, but it was blind to modern stealth. The crew relied on the eyes of others, but those eyes were currently focused elsewhere. Reed noticed a slight flicker on his peripheral display. It was a momentary glitch, or perhaps it was something more. He glanced at his co-pilot. The younger officer was busy with a fuel log. They were managing the distribution of the massive payload. This was a dangerous weight. It required constant attention to keep the aircraft balanced. The tactical situation was a delicate balance of power. Every flight was a chess move in a game that had been played for decades. Today, the board had changed. The absence of the American fighters had created an opening. It was an opportunity that the Chinese command would not waste. The air inside the tanker smelled of recycled oxygen and stale coffee. Reed checked his Normander watch. 8:22 in the morning. They were exactly on time. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. And that was the problem. The American crew felt the first vibration. It was not mechanical. It was the feeling of being watched. It was a professional instinct honed over thousands of flight hours. Reed looked out the side window. He saw nothing but the curve of the earth and the empty sky. The radio remained quiet. The only sound was the rushing wind against the glass. The mission was still routine on paper. In reality, the gravity of the situation was beginning to pull. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 8:25 in the morning, the Philippine Sea. A faint green strobe pulsed on the tactical display. It was a single point of light. It appeared. Then it vanished. Then it appeared again. Major Reed stared at the glass. He felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. This was not a civilian transponder. This was a primary radar return. Something was out there. Something that did not want to be seen. The co-pilot, Captain Miller, noticed the change in the cockpit atmosphere. He looked up from his fuel charts. "I have a contact. Bearing 280. Distance 70 miles. Reed nodded. "It is closing fast. Mach 1.2. That is not a commercial track." The contact was moving too quickly for a cargo plane or a passenger jet. It was cutting across the standard air routes at a sharp angle. It was a direct intercept vector. The crew of Lancer 70 knew The math. At that speed, the distance would close in less than 5 minutes. Inside the cockpit of the Chinese J-16, the pilot checked his systems. He was now 40 miles away. His radar was in a low probability of intercept mode. He was sipping data from a ground-based station on a distant reef. He saw the American tanker clearly. It was a fat, slow target. It was a giant reservoir of fuel hanging in the air. He adjusted his flight path. He wanted to approach from the 6 o'clock position. He wanted to be in their blind spot. Back on the tanker, the crew began their professional response. Miller keyed the long-range radio. The American officer spoke clearly into his headset. Unknown aircraft on heading 110 at 30,000 feet. This is United States military aircraft on a routine mission in international airspace. Identify yourself. There was only static. The silence was a message in itself. Say again, Miller said. Identify yourself and state your intentions. Still nothing. The green strobe on the display was now 40 miles out. It was no longer flickering. The contact was solid. It was committed. Inside the rear of the tanker, the boom operator sat in his small station. He looked through the rear window. He saw nothing but the vast blue horizon. He was the eyes of the aircraft for anything approaching from behind. He adjusted his headset. Flight. Boom. I have no visual. Sky is clear. Reed gripped the control yoke. He is low. Look down toward the water. He is coming up from the basement. The Stratotanker was a massive aircraft. It was over 40 meters long. It could not turn quickly. It could not hide. It was a prisoner of its own flight path. If the intruder was aggressive, the tanker had no way to defend itself. No flares, no chaff, no guns. The J-16 pilot saw the tanker grow in his heads-up display. It was a dark silhouette against the morning sun. He was now 20 miles away. He nudged the throttle forward. The twin engines roared. He felt the push of the G-force against his chest. He was not here to talk. He was here to demonstrate presence. He was here to show that the American reach was becoming shorter. 30 miles, Miller reported. He is accelerating. Mach 1.4. The tanker was flying at 800 kilometers per hour. The intruder was moving at nearly twice that speed. The closure rate was staggering. It was the physical manifestation of a threat. Reed contacted the regional command center. Control. This is Lancer 70. We have an unidentified fast mover on an intercept vector. Distance 25 miles. No radio contact. Requesting guidance. The response from the ground was calm but firm. Lancer, maintain your track. Do not deviate. We are monitoring. Be advised. You are alone out there. The crew felt the weight of those words. There was no one coming to help. The boom operator suddenly gasped into the intercom. Flight. Contact. I have a visual. He just popped up. 6 o'clock low. 5 miles and closing. The Chinese fighter did not slow down. It screamed, upward from the shadows of the waves. It was a gray blur of steel and fire. It was aimed directly at the tanker's tail. 8:38 in the morning. The Philippine Sea. The J-16 did not stop at the tail. It surged forward with a violent burst of speed. The Chinese pilot pulled his aircraft alongside the tanker. He was less than 50 meters from the American wingtip. The gray camouflage of the fighter was stark against the blue sky. The red stars on its tail were clearly visible to the American crew. Major Reed looked out his left window. He was staring directly at the Chinese pilot. The two men were moving at 800 kilometers per hour. They were separated by a distance less than the length of a swimming pool. The Chinese pilot did not look at him. He remained focused on his own instruments. He is on our left wing, Reed said. His voice was flat. Maintain heading. Do not twitch. Suddenly, the J-16 banked hard to the right. It crossed directly over the top of the tanker. The American crew felt a massive jolt. This was a thump maneuver. The fighter used its powerful wake turbulence to disturb the air around the larger plane. The 100-ton tanker shuddered. The flight controls vibrated in Reed's hands. "Watch the autopilot," Miller shouted. "It is trying to overcorrect." Reed disconnected the automatic system. He took manual control of the heavy aircraft. He fought the controls to keep the wings level. This was a physical confrontation. It was a test of nerves. The Chinese pilot was using his jet as a blunt instrument. He was trying to push the tanker off its assigned track. 8:42 in the morning. 7th Fleet Headquarters, Japan. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was electric. Officers stood around a large glass table. They watched the digital icons merge on the screen. The tanker was a blue square. The interceptor was a red triangle. The two symbols were now touching. Lancer 70 is being harassed, a radar controller reported. The J-16 just performed a close-range crossover. Airspeed is fluctuating. An admiral stood at the back of the room. He did not speak. He knew the rules of this game. If the American pilot moved too far to the left, he would be leaving international airspace. If he moved to the right, he would be retreating. Both options were unacceptable. "Tell Lancer to stay the course," the admiral said. "We are not being pushed out today." Back in the sky, the J-16 had circled back. It was now sitting on the right wing. The Chinese pilot looked over this time. He raised a hand. It was not a wave. He was pointing toward the west. He wanted the tanker to turn. He wanted them to leave. Reed ignored the gesture. He focused on the horizon. "Control. Lancer 70. The intercept is becoming aggressive. We have experienced wake turbulence. The contact is within 30 meters. The radio crackled. Copy. Lancer, stand firm. You are in international waters. Your mission is authorized." The Chinese pilot saw that the tanker was not moving. He decided to increase the pressure. He pulled back on the stick and climbed. He disappeared above the tanker's cockpit. "Where did he go?" Miller asked. He leaned forward to look through the top glass. Boom. "Do you have him?" Reed called out. The boom operator's voice was tight. "Negative. He is in the overhead blind spot. I cannot see him." The crew waited. The only sound was the roar of the wind. They were carrying 42,000 kilograms of fuel. They were being stalked by a ghost. 8:45 in the morning. The J-16 pilot tipped his nose down. He was directly above the tanker. He began a slow descent toward the American roof. 8:48 in the morning. The Philippine Sea. The shadow of the Chinese fighter fell across the cockpit glass. It was a dark, flickering shape that blocked the sun for a fraction of a second. Then the J-16 was gone. It had dropped behind the tanker. Major Reed checked his mirrors. He saw nothing. He felt the vibration of the fighter's engines through the floorboards of the Stratotanker. The boom operator's voice came over the headset. It was an octave higher than before. "Flight. Boom. The contact is at our 6 o'clock. He has settled into the pre-contact position. Distance 30 meters. The pre-contact position was a specific patch of air. It was where friendly jets waited before moving in to take fuel. By sitting there, the Chinese pilot was sending a terrifying message. He was mocking the American mission. He was showing the crew that he could touch them whenever he chose. Captain Miller looked at the fuel gauges. He is sitting right behind 42,000 kilograms of explosive. One engine surge, and we both go up. The Stratotanker was never designed for this. It was a logistical asset, not a combatant. It had no defensive systems, no armor, no way to break away from a faster, more agile opponent. If the J-16 pilot made a mistake, there would be no time for a Mayday call. Major Reed keyed his radio to the command frequency. "Control. Lancer 70. The contact has moved to the pre-contact position. He is holding steady at 30 meters, requesting permission to execute an emergency descent and divert to alternate track." The response was delayed by 5 seconds. It felt like an hour. The controller's voice was steady. "Lancer. Control. Permission to maneuver is denied. You are to maintain your current heading and altitude. Do not concede the corridor. Repeat, do not concede. The rules of engagement were clear. The American military would not be intimidated in international airspace, but the men in the cockpit were the ones facing the risk. They were the ones staring at a cockpit full of warning lights and a lethal predator on their tail. 8:52 in the morning. The J-16 pilot nudged his stick forward. He was now 20 meters from the tanker's refueling boom. He was so close that the boom operator could see the individual rivets on the fighter's nose. The Chinese pilot was demonstrating incredible skill. He was holding a precise formation in the dirty air behind the heavy tanker. The boom operator spoke again. Flight, he is closing. 18 meters, 15 meters. He is looking right at me, sir. Reed gripped the yoke until his knuckles turned white. Hold steady. He is just showing off. He is not going to hit us. But Reed did not know that for certain. In the cockpit of the J-16, the Chinese pilot was under his own pressure. His fuel was running low. He had been in the air for a long time. Fatigue was beginning to set in. High-speed formation flying required total concentration. A single sneeze or a momentary lapse in focus would result in a mid-air collision. The Chinese pilot reached for a switch on his console. He was not arming a weapon. He was activating his infrared search and track system. A laser rangefinder pulsed from the nose of the fighter. Inside the American cockpit, a new alarm began to chirp. It was a low-intensity warning. "We are being spiked," Miller said. His voice was a whisper. "He is ranging us with a laser. He is getting a solution." The threat had moved from a physical maneuver to a technical one. The J-16 was now simulating a kill. The tension inside the tanker reached a breaking point. Every man on board knew that they were one trigger pull away from vaporizing. The morning sun was now high and harsh. The glare off the water was blinding. The two aircraft moved as one, a giant and a parasite. They were locked in a dance that neither side knew how to end. 8:54 in the morning, the Philippine Sea. The Chinese fighter was no longer just following, it was hunting. The J-16 moved forward until the nose of the jet was less than 10 meters from the refueling boom of the American tanker. At this distance, the physics of flight became a nightmare. Major Reed felt the Stratotanker wallow in the air. The massive wake of the KC-135 created a vacuum that tried to suck the smaller fighter into the heavy engines. The weight of the 42,000 kilograms of fuel made the aircraft sluggish. It was like trying to steer a skyscraper through a hurricane. Every time the Chinese pilot adjusted his throttle, the air between the two planes compressed. "He is moving inside the dead zone," Miller whispered. He was watching the shadow of the fighter on the water below. "If he touches that boom, we are gone. The spark alone will do it." The American crew was trapped in a metal tube filled with high-octane explosives. They had no defensive systems. They had no weapons. They were flying a giant target at 30,000 feet. There was nowhere to hide and nowhere to go. The mission had ceased to be about fuel. It was now about survival. Inside the J-16, the Chinese pilot was sweating. His flight suit was damp. His vision was narrowed to the small patch of gray metal directly in front of his canopy. He could see the boom operator's face through the small rear window of the tanker. The American was staring back at him. It was a silent, terrifying standoff. The Chinese pilot was pushing the limits of his training. He wanted to see how far the Americans would go before they broke. He moved his finger to the radio trigger. He did not call the tanker. Instead, he broadcast a signal on a common military frequency. "You are interfering with a sovereign exercise. Leave the area immediately or face the consequences." The message was heard by every ship and aircraft within 200 miles. It was a formal warning. It was the legal precursor to an engagement. 8:58 in the morning. The American Command Center on Guam broke the silence. "Lancer 70. This is Control. We are seeing a second red contact. Another J-16 has launched from the mainland. ETA is 10 minutes. How is your fuel state?" Reed looked at his gauges. "Control. Fuel is not the issue. The contact is currently within 10 meters of our airframe. He is posturing for a collision. We are maintaining heading, but the turbulence is reaching a critical level. We are losing stability. The air was becoming more violent. The heat from the J-16's engines was actually warming the skin of the tanker's tail section. This was the edge of the envelope. Any further movement would result in metal hitting metal. Reed looked at Miller. The co-pilot's hands were shaking. "Steady," Reed said. "He wants us to panic. If we dive, he will follow us down. If we climb, we lose airspeed and he rams us. We stay right here." The Chinese pilot saw the Americans' resolve. He decided to play his final card. He did not pull away. Instead, he engaged his combat radar in full search mode. The cockpit of the tanker lit up like a Christmas tree. Every warning light on the dash turned red. The J-16 began to pull ahead. It was moving toward the front of the tanker. It was preparing for the final, most dangerous maneuver of the encounter. The Chinese pilot was going to cross the nose of the tanker and engage his afterburners. "He's moving up," the boom operator called out. "He's coming around the side. He's going for the nose." Reed gripped the yoke with everything he had. "Brace for impact. He's going to wash us out." The sky was about to turn into a vortex of fire and steel. 9 o'clock in the morning. The Philippine Sea. The J-16 surged ahead. It was a silver needle in the sun. It moved with predatory grace. Major Reed saw the twin exhausts of the fighter. They were less than 20 meters in front of his cockpit window. The Chinese pilot was now directly in the path of the heavy tanker. "He is crossing," Miller shouted. He braced his hands against the dashboard. "Hold the line," Reed replied. His voice was a low growl. 30 seconds later, the Chinese pilot slammed his throttles into full afterburner. Two massive plumes of orange fire erupted from the back of the jet. The heat was visible through the glass. The sound was no longer a hum. It was a physical wall of noise. It hit the KC-135 like a hammer. 9:01 in the morning. The wake turbulence was a violent vortex of air. It grabbed the left wing of the tanker and slammed it downward. The 100-ton aircraft rolled 40 degrees in a heartbeat. Alarms screamed. The master caution light flashed a blinding red. Inside the cabin, everything not strapped down became a projectile. The crew felt the crushing weight of the G-force as the plane slid out of the sky. "I have the aircraft," Reed yelled. He used both hands to fight the control yoke. He kicked the right rudder pedal with all his strength. The heavy fuel load shifted in the tanks. 42,000 kilograms of liquid surged toward the low wing. It was a massive pendulum of weight that wanted to flip the plane upside down. The Stratotanker groaned. Metal twisted under the extreme stress. The engines roared as Reed pushed them to maximum power to gain airspeed. "Altitude is dropping," Miller called out. 28,000 feet, 27,000. "We are falling out of the block." The J-16 was gone. It had banked away after the strike. It left the American crew to die in its wake. Reed stared at the horizon. It was tilted at a sickening angle. He felt the controls vibrating. The air was literally being torn apart around them. "Come on," Reed whispered. "Level out. Level out." Slowly, painfully, the heavy nose of the tanker began to rise. The wings started to bite into the air again. The roll stopped at 50 degrees. Then it began to reverse. The aircraft was a wounded giant, but it was still flying. Reed wiped sweat from his eyes. His breathing was heavy. The cockpit was filled with the smell of hot electrical components and ozone. They were back in control, but the threat was not over. The J-16 had looped back. It was coming in for another pass. This time, it was coming from the front. A head-on collision course. 9:02 in the morning. The Philippine Sea. The J-16 was a dark point on the horizon. It grew larger with every heartbeat. It was a head-on intercept. The closure rate was over 2,000 kilometers per hour. At this speed, the human brain cannot process the distance. Only computers and instincts remain. Major Reed gripped the controls. He is not flinching. He is going to buzz the canopy. "Control. Lancer 70, Miller shouted into the radio. "The contact is head-on. We are committed to the track. Tell him to brake. Brake. Brake." The Chinese pilot had his thumb on the trigger. He was not looking for a kill. He was looking for a victory of will. He saw the massive American tanker through his heads-up display. It looked like a wall of gray metal. He waited for the American to dive. He waited for the moment of surrender. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the emergency frequency. It was frantic. It was not military. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Pacific Flight 611. We have lost engine number 2. We are experiencing severe turbulence. We are descending through flight level 300. We cannot maintain heading. Reed froze. He looked at his secondary radar display. A massive icon had appeared out of the clutter of the weather to the south. It was a civilian Airbus A350. It was a long-haul flight from Manila to Los Angeles. It carried 312 passengers. The civilian jet had been forced into the military corridor by a massive thunderstorm. It was now dropping like a stone. It was 5 miles away. It was descending directly into the space between the tanker and the fighter. The Chinese pilot saw the new contact on his radar. His targeting system had been locked on the tanker. Now, it was screaming a collision warning for a target the size of a city block. The civilian airliner was a wall of white paint and glass. It was moving across his nose from left to right. Control. Lancer 70, Reed yelled. We have a civilian heavy in the box. I am turning right. I am turning right now. Reed slammed the controls to the side. He did not care about the protocol anymore. He did not care about the sovereign airspace. He had to move 42,000 kilograms of fuel out of the way of 300 civilians. The tanker groaned as it banked into a steep, dangerous turn. The J-16 pilot was in a dead heat. If he stayed on his course, he would hit the tanker. If he turned left, he would fly directly into the path of the descending Airbus. The predator and the prey were no longer alone. The sky had become a crowded room with no exits. The Chinese pilot made a split-second decision. He pulled his stick back into his stomach. The fighter stood on its tail. It climbed vertically, standing on a pillar of afterburner flame. He cleared the cockpit of the tanker by less than 30 meters. Below them, the massive white wing of the civilian Airbus swept past. It was so close that Reed could see the logo on the tail. The 3 aircraft were now scattered. The formation was broken. The aggression was replaced by a cold, sharp terror. The game of chicken had ended. The fight for survival had begun. Pacific 611, Miller called out. We have you on visual. We are a United States tanker. Do you have control? The reply was a burst of static and a sobbing voice. We are falling. We cannot level out. The morning was no longer about a Cold War. It was about a rescue. 9:05 in the morning. The Philippine Sea. The sky was a shattered mess of high-speed contrails. Major Reed fought to bring the Stratotanker back to a level flight path. The heavy aircraft was still shaking from the violent maneuvers. Behind them, the massive silhouette of the Airbus A350 was visible. It was descending through 25,000 feet. Its left engine was a dead weight. A long trail of white vapor poured from its wing. Inside the tanker cockpit, the radio was a storm of voices. The civilian pilot was struggling to communicate with a distant air traffic control center. The signal was weak and broken. Miller checked the tactical display. The J-16 is circling back. He is coming down from the vertical. He is not in a combat profile. He is high. He is watching. Reed looked at the crippled airliner. The civilian crew was fighting for their lives. They were losing altitude at a rate of 2,000 feet per minute. If they hit the thick, turbulent air at the lower levels, the aircraft might become uncontrollable. Reed keyed the wide area emergency frequency. Pacific Flight 611. This is Lancer 70. We have you on visual. Your left engine is trailing vapor. Your descent rate is too high. You need to shallow your bank to the right. The civilian pilot's voice was strained. Lancer, we have no hydraulics on the left side. We cannot see the engine. Can you confirm fire? Reed looked at the co-pilot. We are too far away to see the nacelle clearly. We need a closer look. Suddenly, a new voice entered the frequency. It was the Chinese pilot. His English was clipped but professional. Pacific 611. This is the fighter aircraft on your port side. I am moving in to inspect. Do not maneuver. Reed watched as the J-16 dove from the upper atmosphere. It did not approach the tanker. It moved directly toward the civilian airliner. The Chinese jet slowed down, matching the speed of the wounded Airbus. It was a display of precision. The fighter moved. Within 30 meters of the civilian engine, 9:07 in the morning, the Chinese pilot spoke again. Pacific 611. I have a visual. There is no fire. Repeat. No fire. You have a massive hydraulic leak at the pylon. Your flaps are partially deployed on the left side. That is why you are pulling to the left. The civilian pilot responded with a breath of relief. Copy. No fire. Thank you. We are attempting to trim the aircraft. Inside the American tanker, Reed and Miller watched the scene in silence. Minutes ago, they were on the verge of a mid-air collision with the same man who was now acting as a rescue scout. The geopolitical tension had not vanished. It had simply been pushed aside by the raw necessity of saving 300 lives. 9:08 in the morning. The Chinese pilot looked toward the American tanker. For the first time, he addressed Reed directly. Lancer 70. I have the better eyes. You have the better radio. Relay my data to the regional controllers. The civilian needs a clear path to the runway at Clark Air Base. Reed did not hesitate. Copy that. We will act as the relay. We are holding altitude at 24,000 feet to maintain line of sight. The coordination was unofficial. It was not authorized by any command center. It was two pilots in a den, dangerous sky, making a choice. Reed contacted the command center on Guam. Control. Lancer 70. We are coordinating with a Chinese aircraft to assist a civilian emergency. Pacific Flight 611 is crippled. We are relaying tactical data. Clear the corridor, all the way to the coast. The controller at Guam paused. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Lancer. Control. We understand. The corridor is yours. We are notifying the Philippine authorities. All military operations in the sector are suspended. 9:10 in the morning. The three aircraft were now in an unconventional formation. The giant Airbus led the way. The sleek Chinese fighter sat on its wing, providing constant updates on the structural integrity of the wing. The American tanker followed behind, acting as a powerful radio beacon and a guide. Confusion still lingered. The crews did not trust each other, but they were now bound by a common goal. He is staying with them, Miller said, watching the J-16. He is not leaving. Neither are we, Reed replied. The descent continued. The Philippine coast was still 200 miles away. The fuel in the tanker was heavy. The air was getting thicker. The most dangerous part of the journey was just beginning. 9:15 in the morning, the Philippine Sea. The three aircraft were now descending through 18,000 feet. The air was thicker here. The turbulence from the morning sun hitting the water created a constant, rhythmic shaking. Inside the cockpit of Pacific Flight 611, the pilots were working with manual trim to keep the nose of the Airbus from dipping. The hydraulic leak had stabilized, but the left wing was partially unresponsive. Major Reed kept the Stratotanker 500 meters behind and above the airliner. He was watching the J-16. The Chinese fighter was still tucked in close to the civilian jet. It was a strange and beautiful sight. The lethal, gray interceptor was flying as a guardian for the white and blue passenger plane. His fuel must be critical, Miller said. He looked at the tactical clock. He has been in afterburner or high power settings for over 40 minutes. That jet is thirsty. As if on cue, the Chinese pilot keyed his radio. His voice was less tense now, but there was a layer of exhaustion in it. Lancer 70. This is the fighter. My fuel state is low. I am reaching my bingo point. I must return to my station. Reed adjusted his headset. Copy that. Fighter, you have done a service here. We have the civilian on our radar, and we are in contact with Manila Center. We will take it from here." There was a long pause. For a moment, the only sound was the static of the open frequency. Then, the Chinese pilot spoke again. "It is a big ocean, Major. Sometimes, it is too big for one nation." 9:22 in the morning. The J-16 began a slow, graceful bank to the west. It did not perform any aggressive maneuvers. It did not engage its afterburners. It simply peeled away from the formation, like a leaf in the wind. The Chinese pilot leveled his wings one last time in a silent salute and then vanished into the haze of the horizon. "He's gone," the boom operator reported. Radar shows him heading due west. 300 knots. He's nursing it home. Reed felt a strange sense of loss. The adversary, who had almost sent them into a terminal roll 10 minutes ago, had become the only other person in the world who understood the gravity of the last half hour. Manila Center. Lancer 70. Miller transmitted. "The military interceptor has departed the area. We are currently at 15,000 feet with Pacific 611. They are stable, but require a straight-in approach for runway 06 at Clark. Confirm the airspace is clear." The Philippine controller responded immediately. "Lancer, Manila Center. The airspace is clear for 50 miles. Emergency services are on the ground. We have you on secondary radar. Thank you for the assist, Lancer." 9:25 in the morning. The Philippine coast appeared as a thin green line through the haze. The danger was not over for the 300 passengers on the Airbus. They still had to land a 100-ton aircraft with compromised flight controls. But the threat of a mid-air collision or a military incident had evaporated. Reed looked at his fuel gauges. He still had 38,000 kilograms of fuel. He had not offloaded a single drop. The mission he had been sent to perform was a failure. But the mission he had found was nearly complete. "Do you think they will report this?" Miller asked. He was watching the civilian jet begin its final descent. "The diplomats will argue about the intercept," Reed said. "The analysts will look at the radar tracks. But the people on that plane will never know how close they came to being a footnote in a war that didn't happen." The Stratotanker began a wide turn to the east, toward Guam. The sun was now high and hot. The Philippine Sea looked like a sheet of hammered silver. The crisis had moved from the cockpit to the conference rooms. The morning was finally quiet, but the silence felt different now. It was heavy with the weight of what had almost occurred. 9:30 in the morning. The Philippine Sea. Lancer 70 was holding a steady orbit 20 miles off the coast of Luzon. Major Reed and Captain Miller watched the secondary radar screen. The icon for Pacific Flight 611 was low. It was slow. It was lined up perfectly with the runway at Clark Air Base. "They are on the 3-degree glide slope," Miller said. He was monitoring the civilian tower frequency. "Gear is down. They are using differential thrust to compensate for the failed hydraulics." Inside the tanker, the tension was a physical weight. The crew had stayed on station far longer than their original mission required. They were low on their own reserve fuel. But no one suggested turning back. They waited for the final word. 9:38 in the morning. The radio crackled with the voice of the Manila controller. "All stations. Pacific 611 is on the ground. Repeat, the aircraft is down and safe. No fire reported. Runway is closed for recovery." A small breath of air escaped Miller's lungs. It was the only sign of emotion in the cockpit. Reed did not smile. He did not cheer. He simply reached for the flight computer and began entering the coordinates for the return trip to Guam. "Copy. Manila," Reed said into his headset. "Lancer 70 is departing your airspace. Switching to oceanic control. Good day." 9:45 in the morning. 600 miles to the west, the Chinese J-16 touched down on a sun-bleached runway on Hainan Island. The pilot taxied his aircraft into a hardened concrete hangar. He shut down the twin engines. The silence that followed was absolute. He sat in the cockpit for a long time. He watched the ground crew approach with fuel lines and inspection ladders. The Chinese pilot climbed down the ladder. He did not speak to his crew chief. He went straight to the debriefing room. He had survived a near collision. He had assisted a civilian emergency, and he had successfully challenged a United States strategic asset. In his logbook, it would be recorded. As a successful sortie, there was no mention of the fear or the sweat. There was only the data. Back on the American tanker, the boom operator stowed his equipment for the final time. He climbed out of the rear pod and entered the main cabin. He sat in the jump seat and buckled his harness. "Everything okay back there?" Reed asked over the intercom. "Everything is secure, sir," the boom operator replied. "Just a long day." "It is not over yet," Reed said. "We have a 4-hour flight back to Guam." Miller, start the fuel management sequence. "We need to balance the remaining load for the cruise." The Stratotanker leveled off at 34,000 feet. The Philippine Sea was behind them now. The vast, empty expanse of the Pacific stretched out ahead. The aircraft was, once again, a lonely point in a very large sky. The professional routine took over. The crew checked their systems. They monitored the weather. They spoke, in short, clinical sentences. The adrenaline of the morning was being replaced by the steady, numbing fatigue of long-range flight. They had avoided a war by a matter of meters. They had saved 300 lives by a matter of seconds. But for the crew of Lancer 70, the mission was not a story. It was a report that still needed to be written. The flight was quiet. The crisis was resolved. 3 days later, 10 o'clock in the morning, the Pentagon, Washington District of Columbia. The conference room was windowless and chilled by high-powered air conditioning. On the central screen, a digital reconstruction of the Philippine Sea incident played in a continuous loop. The blue icon of Lancer 70 and the red icon of the J-16 merged and separated with clinical precision. High-ranking officers sat in the shadows, watching the data. They were not looking at the heroism. They were looking at the centimeters. The telemetry confirms the J-16 reached a minimum separation of 7 meters during the afterburner transition, an analyst said. His voice was tired. He had been awake for 20 hours. The wake turbulence nearly exceeded the structural limits of the KC-135 airframe. If the tanker had been 5% heavier, the wing would have stalled. A general leaned forward. He adjusted his glasses. And the civilian intervention, was it coordinated? Technically, no, the analyst replied. There was no official handoff, but the voice transcripts show a high degree of tactical cooperation. The Chinese pilot provided the initial damage assessment. Major Reed provided the long-range communications. It was a localized de-escalation. The room remained silent. In the world of high-stakes geopolitics, the truth was a complicated thing. Publicly, the State Department had issued a formal protest regarding the unsafe intercept. Privately, a message had been sent through a secure back channel to Beijing. It was not a thank you. It was an acknowledgement of professional conduct in a crisis. 10:30 in the morning. Beijing. Inside a similar room at the Ministry of National Defense, the Chinese pilot stood at attention. He was no longer wearing his flight suit. He wore a crisp, olive-drab uniform. His face was a mask of discipline. Across from him sat 3 older men with rows of ribbons on their chests. "You moved into the path of a civilian aircraft," the senior official said. His voice was like dry paper. "You risked a state asset to assist a foreign carrier." "The situation was evolving, Comrade General," the pilot replied. "The collision risk was absolute. I chose to preserve the safety of the corridor." The officials looked at the data on their own screens. They saw the same blue and red icons. In their view, the American tanker was still an intruder. But the pilot had shown that Chinese air power was not just about force, it was about control. He would not be punished. He would not be rewarded. He would be sent back to his squadron to fly the same track tomorrow. 3 days later. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Anderson Air Force Base, Guam. Major Reed and Captain Miller walked across the flight line. They were not heading to a plane. They were heading to a debriefing with a team of safety investigators. They were grounded until the review was complete. It was standard procedure, but it felt like a wait. Reed stopped and looked out at the runway. A pair of B-52 bombers was taking off, their engines leaving long black trails in the tropical sky. The cycle of the Pacific was continuing. The incident over the Philippine Sea was already being buried under new reports and new missions. "Do you think it changed anything?" Miller asked. Reed watched the bombers disappear into the clouds. "No, the map is still the same. The fuel is still there. We will be back out there in a week, and the J-16 will be waiting." The strategic assessment was clear. Modern warfare is a game of inches played at Mach 1. It is decided by the restraint of individuals when systems are screaming for conflict. No missiles flew, no ships were lost, but history had shifted in the space between two wings. The Philippine Sea was quiet again, but it was a fragile quiet. It was the silence of a held breath.